This is part 2 of the lecture on materiality. How do the meanings of things change over time? Arjun Appadurai observed that, just like people, objects have lifespans with recognizable phases: birth, or the manufacture, exchange, use, and discard, which often begins a new phase of life. It is possible to identify social relationships and cultural ideologies that shape each stage of an object's life. Note that the particular relationships and ideologies vary from culture to culture. These observations are discussed in Appadurai's The Social Life of Things, Commodities and Cultural Perspective, 1986. Consider the life of shoes in the mall. They begin as cotton and rubber in a Chinese production factory, but the mall salesperson doesn't think of them as cotton and rubber, nor does the purchaser. The shoes pass through many sets of hands between production and consumption, manufacture, packaging, transport, and so on. This is likely a journey of thousands of miles and lots of hands. That pair of shoes has a complicated life and takes on meanings from the context it passes through. That journey can reveal a whole range of complex social relations. Three ways objects change over time. All objects change over time, but they can do so in different ways. They can do so by changing form from generation to generation, changing meaning with changing context, and changing meaning from changing hands. The form, shape, color, and material use change from generation to generation. Changing objects may reflect technological advances or, in our consumer culture, often just change for change's sake. For example, see the nearly 400 years of skirt length data and the journey of the lumpy blue sweater described in the text. Fashion is one of those where change for change's sake is very common. Archaeologists use similar stylistic patterning to track changes through time at prehistoric sites. An object changes significance and meaning as its social and physical context change. Such change can be abrupt. Take, for example, the arrival of iron in Tahiti in June 18, 1867. Social changes followed as traditionally conservative Tahitian men sent their wives, sisters, and daughters to prostitute themselves in exchange for British iron. Ironically, this nearly overnight change created a stereotype that Tahitian women were sexually promiscuous. If we look at the image on the slide, it's a lithograph of Captain Samuel Wallis, who lived from 1728 to 1830, being received by the Queen Oberea on the island of Tahiti. A single object changes significance and meaning as it changes hands. A New Guinean stone axe purchased for a museum quickly went from being a useful implement to being a static example of an exotic culture. During the days of the spice trade, common and easily grown Indonesian plants became expensive commodities for the wealthy in Europe. When the Object changes hands, its significance and meaning also can change. How do objects come to represent our aspirations and goals? Objects can express our personal and collective past. Objects help us express and even formulate our goals and aspirations. Objects can be used in ways to manipulate what our goals and aspirations should be. If you think about, for many people, the idea of a dream house and how that dream house affects our aspirations, our goals, and all of those things. The cultural biography of things. Anthropologists can uncover important social relationships and cultural dynamics by studying the cultural biography of objects. We surround ourselves with personally meaningful reminders that convey messages to us and to others, sometimes different and even conflicting messages. And also, communities do these things. The culture of mass consumption. People do not simply imprint themselves and their past onto objects, but rather they also formulate who they are and express themselves through objects, especially their goals and aspirations about their lives. The culture of mass consumption conveniently provides, at a price, nearly limitless objects with which to express oneself. If we think about the image on this slide, modern devices such as smartphones allow us to keep in touch with friends, but they are also examples of what Marx called our, quote, commodity fetish, unquote. They control our attention and have become objects of obsessive desire and worship. If you think about the long lines that often are the result of a new iPhone being introduced, for example. The anthropology of consumption. Consumption is a social act. People define and express who they are through it. Social status, economic means, gender identities, aesthetic sensibilities, individuals' qualities of taste and discernment, and identification with a certain social class or interest group. Shopping is a good illustration of these dynamics. Shopping is only partially a matter of what you like, can afford, and can get access to. It also involves matters of relationship, identity, social positioning, and the creation of cultural meaning. Didn't think all of that was involved in shopping, did you? Advertising. Some people can use objects to manipulate us. Advertising, for example, is not simply an objective, unbiased sharing of useful information. It is a targeted, and I want to emphasize, a targeted attempt to affect human decision making. At best, it is a symbolic framing of specific products. At worst, an attempt to translate consumers' hopes, insecurities, and fears into money. And finally, we close with a review of our learning objectives for this particular unit on materiality. Our objectives were to, first of all, clarify the difference between thinking of the arts solely as a realm of creative expression and a broader anthropological interest in understanding the social dynamics of objects. Identify. Identify the multiple social dimensions of human made objects. Explain. Explain how and why objects have social lives or forms, uses, and trajectories that are intertwined in people's lives in complex ways. And finally, to summarize. Summarize how people use objects to channel desires, aspirations, and consumption patterns as well as to manipulate other people.